How's everybody doing? Hope y'all are enjoying the talk so far. I'm going over web components with Polymer. Web components is something I've been digging a lot into for a while. It's pretty exciting. It's not fully there yet, but where it is really great, and where it lacks, Polymer kind of picks up and allows you to use it. So my name is Josh. I work at Project 202 at the Austin office, like you mentioned. Most of my work is client-side applications, very heavy client-side applications for large clients that they don't always allow us to say that they work for them. But good projects. At Project 202, we're split on most projects into two teams or into two groups of people. One group of people will work on the client-side app, and another set of developers will do the APIs. And usually they are very heavy APIs and very heavy client-side apps. So we take a very much modular component approach to writing client-side applications. So let's start with web components. What are web components? Web components are stuff that we already use in normal framework, well I say normal frameworks, in everyday frameworks, Angular, Ember, Backbone, whatever your flavor is. Web components consist of 4 technologies. 3 of these are very much heard of and very much used today: custom elements, HTML imports, templates, and then there's the shadow DOM, which is very powerful, but kind of unknown, but used heavily in web components. Like I mentioned, web components are used to build component-based web apps. Really simple things we already do if you use Angular, Ember. So the concept isn't too foreign. Why should we use web components? The coolest part to me about web components is that web components are evolving. These 4 technologies are going to be supported in browsers, so you're no longer required to use something like React or Ember to get this functionality. You'll be able to use the power of the browser to do these components that you use to build your client-side apps, which, you know, trying to keep up with frameworks is a nightmare, as we all know. Browser support, as we can see, Chrome and Firefox continue to tease us with features that other browsers don't allow us to use. If you're using Chrome or Firefox, thumbs up. If not, Polymer is your friend. And of course, no one cares about Opera, but IE needs to catch up for us. What is Polymer? Polymer is pretty simple. Polymer is a polyfill framework for web components. Again, these 4 technologies, we want to use them today. We already use them in other frameworks. We want them supported by the browser. Only a couple browsers support them. It's a polyfill framework, pretty simple. Created by Google. When I typed and retyped up these slides, it was at version 1.6, I think 1.0 released sometime last year, and it is in a very stable place that you can use for production now, which is great. Polymer has a handful of features that allow you to create these custom components in web components. Pretty basic features that I think everything uses that, but they kind of go unlisted. Registering elements, lifecycles, DOM templates, data bindings, everything we use in other frameworks, but again, if you're in Chrome or Firefox, it's built into the browser, and if you're using Polymer, then you get these, and we'll see how they're used. To get started with Polymer, since it's web components is kind of a relatively new thing and evolving at a decent pace, to get started with Polymer, you'll want to use the Polymer CLI, the command line interface. Really just 4 lines of code in any command prompt. It uses Bower to do the installation. But one of the cool things Polymer CLI gives you is it has this serve function where it creates a small web server to serve up your HTML, so you don't have to try to create a lightweight node server or PHP, whatever you have it, just to return HTML files. It has a built-in little small web server there. You can learn more at the Polymer Project 1.0 start, how to get started, but I highly suggest the CLI. It also gives you like some basic templated projects, so you can kind of see some Polymer code already in place and kind of how it works. To use Polymer, on every page that has Polymer, 2 files need to be added. Again, because Web Components isn't supported by all browsers yet, you got to bring in the polyfill framework, the Web Component JS, which kind of enables everything, and then Polymer, which cool part about Polymer is it's imported using Web Component technology, HTML import, and you just import the HTML file. So let's start with Shadow DOM, the technology and Web Components that kind of brings all the technologies together. And as much as I wanted it to be, it is not a ninja clan. It is DOM within DOM scoping. It allows you to have scoped JavaScript and scoped CSS. It contains a few tags that we'll go through that are the other features of Web Components, but template, style, and script tags are kind of the basics of Shadow DOM. The Shadow DOM is used simply by using the DOM module tag. When using the DOM module tag and the templates tag, all of this is put together to allow you to create a custom element, which we'll go over in a second, but you use the DOM module tag and you give your DOM module tag an ID, and when registering it with Polymer, your is value is the ID, and that immediately creates your custom element that enables all this heavy functionality with templates and DOM and style scoping, and that's all it takes is just the is value when registering with Polymer. There are other features that we'll see in life cycles when going through this and how they apply to the other technologies in a little bit, but it's really simple. As soon as you register main DOM module is, you can use it like any other HTML tag. DOM scoping, this is one of the really cool features. It also kind of gives you a different way to organize your code. So we'll use the CSS scoping as an example. Globally define a class of red, gives you a background of red. As you see at the bottom, the div that has a class of red will have the background of red, but when you create a custom element with the Shadow DOM, we'll call it redbox so that we can just have a redbox HTML tag. Inside the template is the value that'll be outputted, so we have a div in there with a class of red that says this is also redbox. Our style tag in that custom element is overriding the class of red and setting it to a background of blue. And because of DOM scoping, the first div with a class of red isn't affected. It's really simple, really useful, and the result is as basic as you would expect it. But this allows us to organize our code in a different way. Usually you have a bunch of SAS files that have your CSS related to a component. Now you're able to, if you want to, put your styles directly with the component side by side, keep them together all in one place. So the Shadow DOM is used and essentially creates a custom element that is an HTML tag. So let's go through custom elements, and if you've used anything Angular, any directive that becomes a custom element, essentially you're familiar with it. Face tag that's pretty much basically what it comes down to. It allows you to have custom HTML names. One caveat that they require is that you do have a dash in the name, so you're not using reserved names. You're not trying to override a div or span and with your own functionality. You do have to have a dash, and every custom element does get a display inline by default. So if you're confused why things aren't floating right, that's probably why. Registering an element. This is all it takes to create a custom element. And again, we just seen this with the Shadow DOM, so it's pretty basic. Create the DOM module, give it an ID, a face tag. Inside the template is the value that gets outputted. And when you register it, immediately when you register it, it now is in the DOM, where you have access to use it like HTML and use it in JavaScript, which we'll see in a second. And again, the simple usage is just face tag, and this is a face tag value in your browser will be outputted in between the open and close tags. So I want to make a note that we can set var face component equal to the Polymer register, and this allows us to use the DOM in JavaScript usage, where we can create a new element by saying new face component. This is the same that we already use in vanilla JavaScript. Pretty straightforward. When registering a custom element, what also happens is, because it's in the DOM, you get to use this custom element face tag like you would use any other div or known built-in tag. So document.create element face tag will also create the tag as if you put it directly in the HTML page. Then you can append it to anything else, modify it however you like. The browser thinks it's a normal tag. And just like in vanilla JavaScript, we do have prototyping and lifecycle in these custom elements. So this is a more in-depth way of, or it gives you more functionality when registering with Polymer, but if you create your element and you need it to have certain functions, on this one I added an alert function. When you register, when you use your element, you say new face component or document.create element. After that element's created, you have the .alert available to you. You can use it on callbacks actions. Excuse me. And you can put any function here you would like to extend it. So you can have full name here, alerts, submits, anything you'd like. And then there's a lifecycle. It uses the same lifecycle that's built into vanilla JavaScript. So here I'm showing an example of the created. So right after the element's created, we'll do the this.text content, and we'll change it to a value of project 202. That'll replace what's in the HTML tags with whatever value you add there. One of the things Polymer did was they implemented their own lifecycle functions. I don't know why they did this, because one that they implemented was created callback, and it is literally the exact same thing as created. It does nothing different. It doesn't do it at a different time. It happens at the same time. You could use it if you'd like. If you're used to the existing ones, use the existing ones. They work the exact same way. Templates. So in the Shadow DOM, you use the Shadow DOM to create a custom element. Inside the custom element, inside the Shadow DOM is a template tag. That is the value that gets outputted. So these are where your custom elements start to come to life. The template has some functionality along with it, and this one template tag becomes very powerful, and we'll see in a second. It has a content attribute, some data binding. We'll see how to use nested templates, and one of the cool parts about templates that is very useful feature we use is repeating. But templates in itself are very basic, even though it has a lot of features. You define a template tag, you put some content in it, it's outputted as we've seen on a custom element. But you have the option of this content tag. So when you use your face tag element, and if instead of just putting the text directly in a template, if you put it in the open and close tags, this is my face, that content gets outputted between the content tags. So now you have the ability to pass in a content, a dynamic image based on the user that's logged in, and then using the content, you can place that image anywhere you would like in your template. If you had the user's name first and then below it you output the content tag and you're passing an image, it will place it wherever you put the content tag. But the content tag has an extra piece of functionality with a select attribute, and this is pretty cool. The select attribute is a value of a CSS selector. So when you use your custom element, and in this case I called it main template, I pass in two divs, one with the ID of full name and address, and the select attribute will go into the content that you're passing it, use the CSS selector to find the HTML and output that HTML in that content tag. So in this example, full name will never get shown, only the address, because our select attribute is an ID of address. And this gives us another way to dynamically pass in content to custom elements. So here's another example. We took our full name, our address, but in our template, we put content with a select attribute of full name. We just put a hard-code, we put a div in there with a hard-coded string of lives at and then address. And this allows us to, again, put our content wherever we would like when we pass it in between our open and close main template tags. So different way of passing in dynamic content, but kind of useful. So let's talk about, passing in content through HTML tags and strings is good and all, but it's not how we normally do things. We usually bind data with curly braces, as it's most likely seen. So let's look at some binding data, nesting templates, and bringing that together with repeating through a list of items. So here I'm creating a custom element. I'm calling it a user list. Our template is the content that gets outputted, and we'll go through that in a second. But registering Polymer. So with Polymer, I register the element. I call it user list because that's the ID of the DOM module. And I'm using the ready function, which is one of the callbacks. There's 4 of them. Yeah, there's 4 of them. I'm using a ready here, and on ready, I'm doing a this.users. I'm just setting it to an array. Now, this could be an array of strings, array of objects. I've just put array here because it can be really anything. In our template tag, we're using another template tag to utilize a DOM repeat functionality. So this template tag, we give it an is attribute of DOM repeat, and this immediately tells Polymer that you're going to loop through something. So again, the same thing we already use in other frameworks, but now use as an attribute in Polymer, eventually built into the browser. So we call it DOM repeat. We have to tell it what items we're looping through. This is users that we set in our ready function. And on each loop, each item we're setting as a user. Inside of that template tag, we then can bind data with curly braces, user.firstname, user.lastname. And this gives us now another way to deal with data that we do on a day-to-day in our applications. Not the best example because we still need to dynamically pass in data. So when you create your component, of course your component's not hard-coded to specific data, it has to be dynamic. So in this example, we are passing an array of users to user list when we use it. This just has 2 strings, Joshua and Marshall, and when we're repeating through it, we're still repeating through users as a user, and we're just outputting the string as user. But to get that to pass over, when we register our custom element with Polymer, we got to create a property, and that property is going to be called users. Now, properties are a little weird in Polymer. They get used in 2 ways. You can either you can hard-code a value with properties, so you can say users and put a hard-coded array there, or you can just say it's a type of array. When you do that, Polymer looks for an attribute named users, and it's expecting that value to be an array. If that value is not an array, it's going to throw an error, and this component won't work. So it expects it to be an array. It then takes the array and then passes it to the template and does its normal looping. And now we have another way to dynamically pass data to custom components. You can think of a list of repositories that you have to pass to, list of products, whatever you would like. And this data doesn't have to be hard-coded. So let's talk HTML import. So we create the custom element. We got these components put together. We're not going to pile them all in on one page because it's not really useful to anyone. You want to keep your components organized in their own files, kind of the way you do now. With Polymer, or with web components, they have this function of HTML importing, which is incredibly useful, and it's very similar to any other framework going out and using Ajax to get a HTML template that gets used with a require statement that gets looped through to output, whatever happens. This is really simple. The same way that you link in CSS, you link in an HTML file. So it's a link tag. It has a relation of import, and then you just put the location to your component. All of your custom elements and your custom tags are inside of this component HTML. So you could have 5 of these for 5 different components, or 500 of these for all these components. And when you're using these imports, each component can import other components. So you can create utility components, something simple like a ULLI list, and that gets utilized by something that actually styles the list or adds functionality to the list, whatever you'd like. One of the things to note about the import is it uses the same execution order as normal HTML. And this is important to know, and we'll look in a second how that affects and why you have to keep that in mind. And a small note through using these, if you just put an image tag in your component, as soon as it brings it in, that image kind of comes to life. If you want to delay image tags or CSS of actually doing something, put them inside of a template, and they don't actually, nothing comes to life until you use that custom element. So let's look at the execution order. We'll import sign-up form in our index.html file. That'll execute first. We have a title tag and then a script3.js. The script3.js doesn't immediately run because it goes through the execution order of the sign-up form. So script 1 and script 2 will then run second and third, and then your script 3 will run. This is important to know because, like I mentioned, components can import other components. And if you're debugging these or trying to find issues, you can start to go down a small rabbit hole of a lot of components and not understanding the execution order or when data is available. So keep the execution order in mind when you're creating these components. It saves you in the long run. So Polymer in itself is pretty powerful. It's kind of something new, not straightforward, because it's a little different than stuff we already use. So what the Polymer team did was they created a bunch of pre-made components, which they call Polymer elements. And it's really nothing more than just grouped together pre-made components. They put them in 8 groups. We'll go through these and kind of see how they get used. You can use these components for examples, to see how to create components. You can use these components using your own components if you'd like to. There's nothing special created about them. They use the same technology you would use to create components. They're just made by and supported by the Polymer team. And all these can be found at elements.polymerproject.org. So app elements, as they call them. These are full-page web functionality. One that I found really useful in digging through and looking at these different types of component in what's already there is we build a lot of apps for really big clients that are international, and every time we have a conversation with someone, they always ask about localization or internationalization. The Polymer team has actually solved this in a component, and it's the localized component. And you bring it in with NPM like you would anything else. And when you create a custom element, we're going to call this one XApp. When you create a custom element, and you have included this localized, it gives you what's called behaviors. Behaviors, of course, isn't something I've gone over yet, but these behaviors are kind of behind-the-scenes functionality that your registered element can leverage to do specific things or run automatically. So in this example, we're creating a custom element. We're calling it XApp. We're going to bring in this localized behavior. This localized behavior is created, and it's looking for specific conventions. And I'll show you what that is in a second. So we'll create a properties object. In there, we'll set language, and you will set the value equal to English. Now, this is where you would set it based on the browsers. Based on the browser's value, you could set it to English, French. You could set whatever language you would like in this case. And as soon as this element is attached, this is another one of those callback. As soon as it's attached, we're going to load some resources. And one of them we're going to load is a locales JSON. Now, that behavior is looking for that locales JSON in the attached, and it's going to use this when binding inside of that template. So as we see, the template is binding with a function called Localized. Now, that's not a function we created. That's inside of the localized behavior. This is what the locales JSON file would look like, and this is kind of what it's expecting. So in our case, we set property language value of English. So when it loads the locales in there, it's going to take that value of English and bring in that object there. That object from the locales JSON is going to get used when binding. And so you call the localize function. It uses that English object from your locales file, and we're going to give it a key of hello. So it looks for the key of hello. My name is Josh, and that is what it binds to your template object or your template tag, and this gets outputted in your custom element. So now, using the same functionality we already use, we bring in a behavior, and we've increased our functionality of our app of being able to bring in new languages. And this is a good thing to keep in mind up front, because trying to retrofit languages is a nightmare. So if you build this in early, doesn't take any extra code, you just keep a localized JSON file, and in the future, if a client ever needs to switch it over to French or Spanish, it's real easy to add in a new language. Iron elements. Iron elements are probably the ones you'll use most, especially when you get going. These are utility elements. These were created for the sole purpose of using in other web components. So the Polymer team uses iron elements in all these other web components. Every time you install or download an app elements or one of these other pre-made web components, you'll see that it brings in these iron elements. These are just utilities in the end. Each one of these, there's a whole bunch of them. You can go to the Elements Polymer site and search through. There's a whole lot of these, and each one of them does a small bit of functionality, but you can use as many of them as you would like in your own custom components. The one we'll look at is iron input, and I'm looking at this one for a specific reason, because one thing you've noticed I haven't talked about is two-way data binding. There is no two-way data binding in Polymer. If you need two-way data binding, you have to bring it in yourself. It's real simple to code, but on top of that, you really don't have to code it because the Polymer team did it for you. So it's called iron input. You import the iron input HTML file, and then when you use this inside of your template, all you need to do is put an attribute of is iron input, and this automatically creates two-way data binding. And in my very overly simple example, set the bind value to whatever value it is, and then in brackets, we're just going to output that value. And when you run this example, as soon as you start typing in the input, it outputs right where those open and closed brackets are of my value. Another thing I want to note here is that this is a very simple example. It's probably not the way you would normally use it. On your template, if you put a is DOM bind, you can put that template tag anywhere on your page, and as soon as the DOM is bound and everything's ready to go with JavaScript, Polymer processes this and will put an input wherever this is sitting. So you don't need to put this in a DOM module. Probably not the way you'll use it because you want more control over your template, but is a way of using it. But this is a very simple example that Polymer has already coded out the two-way data binding. So if you're doing user forms, new user forms, contact forms, calculators, whatever you'd like, you don't have to worry about the two-way data binding. It's already done for you. Paper elements. I mentioned this was created by Google, so of course the Polymer team is in Google, so of course they created a whole bunch of web components that leverage material design. Every aspect of material design is already coded out. If you bring in something simple like a button, and you put the custom element of paper button on there, it automatically gets styled with material design. It even has support for attributes like raised that will style the button as a raised button. And that's really all it takes. It's all Paper Elements is there for is utilizing material design. So if you want to do a proof of concept or you really like material design, it's done for you. Google Web Components, again, being a Google team, these leverage all of Google's products and services. And these are pretty useful if you build a lot of apps and you use a lot of Google Maps or their analytics. Because maps get used all the time, I'll just show a quick example of using a Google Map. You import the Google Map HTML. It gives you a Google Map custom tag, and when you give it latitude, longitude, respectively, it just creates the Google Map right there on your page with all the functionality. When you dig through the documentation of each of these components that go to YouTube or Google Maps, they have a bunch of attributes to control the behavior like you would normally control with JavaScript, clicking, zooming. All that is given to you by default in attributes, so you don't have to write all the JavaScript for it. You just bring in Google Maps, drop it on a page, and it's there. Gold elements, e-commerce used. There's not a bunch of these, but they are powerful, the ones that are there. They're used for e-commerce forms. One of the ones I like the most is this credit card input that they created. When you bring in the credit card input in NPM, you'll see that an iron elements input comes in. Because the credit card input is so powerful, it uses so many other web components to build it out, so it will also use some material design. And I like to give this one as an example because this is a good one to look at if you want to build your own, because this does a whole lot. It uses existing web components, plus in itself it has a lot of functionality. When you bring in the credit card inputs, I like to put this auto-validate attribute on there, and what it does is as you're typing in a credit card number, it automatically finds what type of credit card it is, and tells you whether it's a valid number or not. And one of the things it does is you're going through it, it puts this little Visa icon up on the right, and it gets that icon from material design. And if you erase it and type in a MasterCard, it throws up the little MasterCard icon, plus it tells you whether it's valid or not. So they're really powerful, and it's a really good place to start looking at when you're creating really in-depth and your own web components. Neon elements, it's for animating Polymer-based web designs. I don't use these too often, and they go really in depth, but the animation of these is pretty much powered by behaviors. And in your properties, you give it a config, and then it gives you a play animation function that really you can do anything with, but I don't use them too often. Platinum elements, I have no experience with these. I just think they're really cool. I haven't used them yet. They give you the ability that if you're doing like a desktop app with web technologies, you have access to stuff like Bluetooth. Molecules, there's only 2 of these, and these are just wrappers for third-party libraries. One of the main ones that I like is they used mark.js and put it inside of a web component. So when you bring it in, you get this marked element, and there's an attribute called markdown, and you just give it your string, and it converts it right to it converts it right to HTML for you, and gives you the ability that if you use this, you can leverage it to create, I guess in a CMS, a markdown editor pretty easily with writing very little code. You bring in another web component with it, you can do two-way data binding, and all of a sudden you've got a markdown editor, and you've done practically no work. Which leads me to building your own components. Everything that Polymer does is component-based. Everything we strive to do nowadays is reusable functionality. So I definitely encourage that after you get into Polymer that you go through the elements library, see how they do things, leverage what they've already done. It's not, I'm not always trying to reinvent the wheel, but sometimes, you want to reinvent the wheel, and this is a place where you can kind of see what they've already done and use that in your own work. So what's missing from Polymer? No framework's perfect, as we've seen. That's why we all know how to use 15 different frameworks. Routing, they do have routing in their components, but it's still in beta. And this is the thing that, as client-side developers, we never let the browser refresh anymore. And this is where routing comes into play now. Because it's still in beta, I don't encourage anyone to use it for production. But this is something that's still missing. Well-documented AJAX, it doesn't really come with that. It has some functionality, but not the way you would normally use it. But as we've seen in Ben's talk, the supported in the browser fetch is a really good option to use, but it's still not there. And then I just put and more, because with any framework, as you get into it, usually it looks great on the surface, and when you get into it, you figure out it's a nightmare and doesn't have what you need. And that's when you really start to learn about the framework, doing stuff you want to do your way, but you expect it to do something else. So you'll find things that it doesn't have, but you also find that with every framework. But I highly encourage everyone to look into web components. It'll be great as soon as all browsers support it, and now with Chrome supporting it, if you do anything with Electron, you automatically get that without having to bring in Polymer itself. Thanks.